Well, welcome to Allegiance to the King. This is our online church. And tonight, uh, um, we haven't done this in a while. I want to say it's been about a year, but we're doing a Holy Spirit night tonight where we focus in on subjects regarding the Holy Spirit. And tonight, the teaching is titled Bad Listeners Don't Hear the Lord Either. We're going to talk about the idea of a um, someone who is not listening to the, um, doesn't listen to people, probably isn't a very good listener when it comes to listening to the Lord as well. So we want to become better listeners. We're going to talk about the time. But before we get into that, um, just so you know, if you don't already know, that Allegiance to the King's online church is intended to be a church home for isolated biblical Unitarians. So if that's you, if you've been a biblical Unitarian for a long time, or you've become one in recent times, and there's no church in your area that believes and follows, the one God, that the Father is God and Jesus is his son, but he's not God. And you don't have anybody there in your area to have, regular Christian fellowship with. That's what we're here for. We're a group online that meets to actually have a church, not just teachings like this, but to actually be a church family together. We have two services per week. This is our Wednesday night service tonight. And you can find out more at a2kchurch.org, the number 2k church.org, and just check us out. Come and send us a note. Come and join us. We'd love to have you. Okay, so here's my premise for the teaching tonight is that in order to hear from the Lord clearly, you need to be a good listener. Now, the children of God are always hearing from the Lord. He's a good father. He's always talking to us. But, if I'm not a good listener, then, I'm going to have trouble hearing anything from him because I'm not listening. Or I might mangle up what he says, right? I kind of hear something, but then it kind of twists around because, again, I'm not a good listener. Or I might even add a bunch of my own stuff in, thinking that that's, from the Lord as well. And once again, because I'm a bad listener, and so I don't want to be a bad listener. I want to hear from God. You don't want to be a bad listener. You want to hear from God. But if we don't have good listening skills, that's going to be a little bit of a struggle. So tonight, I'm going to cover four areas. We're going to talk about signs of a bad listener. What are the signs of a bad listener? I need to think about this for myself. And, am I doing these things? As well as we can evaluate other people in terms of their listening skills. And I'll talk here in a minute about why that might be really important. Then we'll talk about what makes a good listener, and then how to get better at listening. And then we'll focus in at the last part on active listening, which is a skill and certain practices of listening that can make you a better listener. So let's talk about signs of a bad listener first of all. And why would I want, signs of a bad listener? Well, first of all, I want to know, am I a bad listener? But then knowing someone else is a bad listener, when it comes to hearing from the Lord, a person who is prophesying to you, saying, well, I really feel like the Lord is telling you that, you need to know this or you need to do that or whatever. And you want to think about, is that person a good listener? Do they have good listening skills? And, maybe I don't know them and I can't evaluate that. But if I do know them and I do know what they're like, and they've got any of the qualities that I'm about to talk about, or they like regularly, they're being a bad listener, I kind of want to be skeptical about whether they're really hearing from the Lord or not, because I know in my experience with them that they're a bad listener with me. If I'm trying to tell them something and they're just not getting it because they're doing all these bad habits regarding listening, well, they probably do those same things with God. And so I want to be a little careful with receiving a prophecy from someone who's a bad listener. All right, so here's some signs. Interrupting. This is a big one, right? Is right at the top. And we all know how we feel about somebody interrupting us when we're in the middle of trying to convey something, cutting the speaker off before they've finished speaking. And there's lots of reasons why a person might do that. They might be excited, they might be mad. They might just be somebody who has struggles with, a lot of people with ADHD struggle with interrupting, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, one, you can't really listen if you're interrupting. And two, even if you're not meaning to, it always shows a lack of respect for the thoughts of the person who was speaking. So interrupting, if a person is interrupting a lot, if they have that as kind of a habit, that's a sign of a bad listener. Lack of eye contact, somebody who's just sort of distracted, in terms of their focus. They're looking off and, some other direction or something. If they're not looking at you, there's a pretty good chance they're not listening to you. Sometimes they might not be listening to you if they are looking at you, and sometimes a person might be looking off thinking about what you're saying. But if you can tell the person, you're trying to talk to them and they're looking at some other thing, again, a phone, a TV, some other people, whatever, a dog, a baby, they're probably not listening to you. And distractions, if they're fidgety and they're checking their watch or their phone all the time, the notification goes off and they immediately check it. Well, that's something, again, these are all things that we can do, all of us can do, but when it's a person who's a bad listener, this is a kind of a constant thing. Um, Judgmental responses. So they're quick to judge and criticize or dismiss, tell you about how, why their opinion or their view is better, or why, quick to judge your feelings on the matter and tell you why you shouldn't feel that way. They really haven't heard you out. They really can't. If you really press them, they wouldn't be able to articulate what your position is. They just made a snap judgment. And, and so that sort of thing is an indicator of a bad listener. If they have autobiographical listening, and this is an interesting one. So this is where everything that you're saying, they're relating to their own experiences rather than trying to focus in on your message. So this might be where, you know, you're talking about something and you say something and they're like, "Oh yeah, I know all about that." In fact, this one time, and now they're going to tell you their story about that. And again, we can all be guilty of this, but what we're talking about here is a person who's consistently doing these things, and it's kind of frustrating when they do it. They fail to reflect or clarify, and I think this is a common failure. I would say most of the people that I encounter fail at this particular one, but certainly a bad listener doesn't typically reflect on what you're saying or ask a lot of clarifying questions. They're really trying to, they're not really trying to understand what you're saying, and you can tell that because they don't ask you any questions. They make assumptions. They say their opinions, and they're not really trying to get to understanding with you. And reflection and clarification are keys to that. It's really hard to understand another person. And if you're not asking clarifying questions and probing questions, you're not really trying to understand them. And so it's you can tell a bad listener because they don't ever do that. And then finally, they're very selective listening. So they're only hearing parts of the conversation, and a lot of times it's going to be the parts that they like. If it's something they don't like, maybe they're ignoring it, or they are, cut you off and they want to focus on this one thing that's maybe even a side thing, but it's a bigger deal to them. And so they do all these things that it's selective in what you're saying, and the rest they're either not listening to or they don't care about, or because of their own beliefs, they just disagree with you and they don't care about that. And so a person who selectively listens a lot, you can know, okay, that's not a good listener. So if a person has all of these characteristics, again, I'm going to question whether they can really hear very well from God. I'm not saying that they don't hear from God. God again speaks to any of his children. He's going to speak to them a lot. They just aren't a good listener. All of these things as well are habits that we may have. Maybe we're not a bad listener, but maybe we have habits within these that are we do too often, or maybe when we are trying to listen to somebody, we're guilty of doing some of these things, and we need to be paying attention to that. So what makes a good listener? So first of all, empathy. Really, empathy is a sort of a foundation for listening. You need to be able to understand and share the feelings of the speaker, and that's going to help you to understand their message. If you're in your own world and you're not trying to empathize with them, you're not really going to be able to connect with them. So that connection of empathy for that other person and what they're saying and really wanting to try and understand them is critical to getting to the place where you do actually understand them. And a good listener, that's what they're trying to do. Paying attention, maintaining eye contact again, and physically being focused on them and engaged in that conversation. A good listener, again, they're not distracted looking off at other things and stuff like that. They're zeroed in on the other person that's speaking, and they're really paying attention. They're non-judgmental in their attitude. So they're listening. They're really trying to understand. They're trying to get the perspective of the person, and they're doing it without forming quick judgments or opinions about what they're saying. And in fact, if a person does do those sorts of things, it tends to shut down the other person. They're probably not going to open up if they know that, if they say something, you're probably just going to immediately argue with them and judge them, judge you. You're probably not going to continue to open up and talk about whatever it is that you're talking about. So a good listener sets that stuff aside and pays attention and listens and just leaves judgment out of it until they really understand, and they can make better judgments because they've actually gone through that process. A good listener is also patient. They have a lot of patience. They allow the speaker to express their thoughts fully without interrupting them or rushing them. Can you get to the point? So, this is sometimes you'll find people that they just want you to, they don't need you to say all this. Just get to your point, get to your point. But maybe the person needs to work through some stuff before they can get to their point. A good listener is patient. They will be quiet for a good amount of time before they say anything. Clarification. A good listener, again, they ask a lot of questions. They make sure that they're actually understanding. They may ask, what do you mean by such and such term? Can you elaborate on this last thing that you said? They're asking those kinds of questions because they're trying to get understanding. They want clarification because again, a good listener truly wants to understand. And then reflection. So they're going to paraphrase, they're going to summarize what you say. They're going to say things like, "So, okay, so I think what you're saying is A, B, C. Is that right?" And they give you the opportunity then to say, "Yeah, well, okay, so A is correct, but B, that's not exactly what I'm saying." And they're going, "Okay, good. Help me understand that more." So they're reflecting back to make sure that they've actually done a good job of listening. So that's a good listener. And that's what we want to aspire to, is to be that. So how do we get there? How do we get better at listening? So first of all, we need to practice active listening. And just briefly, this is a series of practices in listening where you're consciously doing things to be focused on the other person and be engaged in what they're saying. And so we'll talk more about that in a minute. Developing empathy, really working on setting aside your own thoughts and emotions and feelings and trying to get at, how does this other person feel? and how can I connect to how can I put myself in their shoes? So I need to develop that. And empathy obviously is, I'm in talking about the things in this list that I'm going to talk about. The only one I'm going to really focus on is the practice of active listening. But in all these things, you can do stuff to grow in each of these areas, and growing in empathy will help with listening. Improving your patience, learning how to be quiet and to really listen, and to stop yourself in from you got all these thoughts going on, and you want to tell them something, and to take a breath and stop. And so practicing and improving your patience. And I think one of the things that you can do in improving patience is when there's someone that when you talk to them, it just immediately you're wanting to interrupt them, maybe because they're wrong about stuff all the time, or maybe they're long-winded, and you just really want them to get to the point of whatever it is. That's a good opportunity to practice patience. Force yourself to take a breath and focus on them, and just listen for a while. Seek out feedback. This is a really, really important thing to do to grow in any way. Uh, doesn't have to be just listening, but certainly with becoming a better listener, you need feedback. You need to know where your blind areas are, and those habits of a bad listener that we talked about earlier, asking people that are close to you, how am I doing? How do you feel when I'm supposed to be listening to you? Are there things that I do that you think I'm not listening to you because I'm doing this or I'm not doing that? And have people give you feedback. Tell them you're trying to get better at listening. And maybe your spouse or your kids or your parents or your friends or your coworkers, anybody that you have a good enough relationship with that you feel comfortable with, saying, "Hey, I want to get better at this. So I want you to tell me when I'm doing something that is a bad habit with listening." Mindfulness training. And if you don't know what mindfulness is, it's essentially a kind of meditation. It's not Eastern meditation, but it's meditation where you are practicing or doing a focusing on something and keeping your mind focused on whatever that is. So it could be, for instance, I'm going to read the Bible, or I'm going to listen to the Bible, or I'm going to listen to a teaching or something like that. Or it could just simply be I'm going for a walk and I'm just going to pay attention to the trees for a while. Whatever it is, I'm going to stay focused on that thing for as long as I can. And then I practice that. I get better at it. There's actually apps that you can get for your phone that will help you to practice mindfulness. But what that is doing is it's helping you to focus. And one of the keys to good listening is being able to stop all of that stuff going on in your head that's going in 90 different directions, and instead stay focused and paying attention on what that other person is saying. And then, read and learn. There's podcasts, there's books, yeah, I'm sure there's seminars that you can go to on, on getting better at listening. And if you see feedback and you find out from your family and friends, yeah, you're a terrible listener. And in fact, there's things I don't even want to talk to you about, because as soon as I start trying to talk to you about it, you're going to interrupt me and you're going to go on about what you think about that instead of listening to what I'm saying about it. If that's the kind of feedback that you get, you might need to go to a seminar. But certainly, this is a life skill that's a really, really important life skill for anybody, and it's important to grow in life skills that are meaningful. So, read and learn. All right, so let's talk about active listening, and we're going to talk about 6 different practices of active listening. I'll give you a couple of examples of things within that, um, you know, uh, that particular area of practice. This is just an overview. I highly recommend, if you've never heard of active listening, or maybe you've heard of it, but you've never really done any training in active listening, that this is a skill in life that's a really big deal. And so this particular approach to that is a highly successful approach in giving you specific things and practices that you can do to get better at it. So the first area or practice is to give full attention, to really um, learn to focus in, completely focus on the speaker without distractions. This includes turning off your phone, your whatever devices, turning off a TV, that kind of thing, facing the speaker and maintaining eye contact. We want to give that person our absolute full attention. So we can actually practice that kind of focus. The mindfulness that I talked about, being present in the moment in that conversation and not your mind's, elsewhere. I think one of the things that we can do, especially with people that we have some level of relationship and trust with, is to be honest when our mind has wandered off and to apologize for it, not try to hide it. I over the years, I as I grew up and as a young man, I learned really well how to recover from my mind wandered. My mind wanders a lot. So, somebody's talking to me, my mind wanders and I'm like, uh-oh, I realize it. And uh-oh. And so I try and bring it back in and I'm trying to hide the fact that I don't know what they just said. I don't think that's good. It actually helps me to say to the other person, you know what? I'm sorry. My mind was wandering and I didn't hear that last thing. I apologize. Would you mind repeating that for me, please? If this person is a person certainly that I trust, we have a good relationship, they're going to respect the fact that I let them know that I didn't hear but I do actually value what they say and I'm trying to bring myself back into the conversation. So learning that mindfulness, practicing that helps me to keep that full attention. The second practice is learning and utilizing nonverbal cues. So we talked a little bit about eye contact. Eye contact is really a good thing to practice because it helps you to stay engaged. And for the other person, it helps them to know that you're likely engaged. And the combination of those two things helps propel the conversation in profitable ways. Body language, use open and inviting body language, nod, smile, use facial expressions to convey interest, that kind of stuff. And um, we can actually pay attention to our body language, to the other person's body language, certainly, but also we can pay attention to our own body language. And, am I kind of being closed off? Am I sort of turning away from the person like I want to run away? Okay, I'm signaling to them that I'm not listening. So I can practice setting up the nonverbal cues that tell the other person I am listening. It helps me to engage. It helps them to be more engaged. Now, this next one I'm going to give you, this I like to call this is a superpower, and superpowers can be used for good or evil. And this is called mirroring. This is where you subtly mimic the speaker's body language to show empathy and understanding. I learned this many years ago when I was going through some sales training that this was high level sales training for doing sales at for where you're selling millions of dollars worth of equipment and stuff like that, or services that are very expensive and that kind of stuff. And so we went through, myself and others went through very intensive training. One of the things that they showed us was mirroring, doing this where if that person's arms are crossed, you cross your arm. If they're leaning on the table, you lean on the table. If they're leaning back, you lean back. If they've got their legs crossed, you cross your legs. You mirror their body. And I thought it was the dumbest, strangest thing that I'd ever heard, but I decided to try it. And so I started trying it and I found it was like a magic trick. You could take a person who maybe was a little standoffish and mirror them, and pretty quickly they're more engaged in this conversation between the two of you. They're more interested in talking about whatever they're trying to talk about. They're more interested in listening to what you're having to say. And so I would say this about mirroring, because it can be abused and be manipulative, but it also can set the other person at ease. if I have the right motives in the situation where I'm really trying to understand them, I want them to open up so that we can connect better and I can understand them better. I can use mirroring to help put them more at ease and more engaged in the subject. So nonverbal cues, that's the second practice. Third practice is reflective responses. So a couple of areas for reflective responses to practice is paraphrasing. This is where you're going to repeat back what the speaker has said in your own words. So, for example, you might say something like, "So, what you're saying is that you feel angry because I forgot your birthday, right?" Okay, that you need to, put it back in your own words and repeat back. And I want to remind us that what we're talking about here is with people, but this is also something that I can do with God. So God says something to me. I can paraphrase it back to God. Okay, so I think this is what you're saying, God. I paraphrase it back. Okay, I, Lord, I think what you're saying is that I need to do A, B, and C, or I need to be thinking in a different way, and here's how I need to be thinking. And let the Lord confirm, yep, that's exactly what I'm saying. Nope, no, no, you're not understanding what I'm saying. And so if you get good at this stuff with people, you will be better at it with the Lord. The second one is summarizing. And so summarizing, this is a little bit different. Paraphrasing, I'm kind of taking what they have just said to me and I give it right back to them in their own words. Summarizing is where I'm going to say, okay, in the things that you're saying, here's how I would summarize it. You made point A, point B, point C. So you might say something, if I understand correctly, your main point, let's say that you're talking about, Trinity stuff or whatever. Your main point is that that in order to be a good Protestant, you have to be skeptical about the church fathers. Am I right in that? Yes. So paraphrasing and summarizing can help in terms of developing your understanding, because if you do this, they can tell you whether you've actually understood or not. And you can use it, you can paraphrase right in the middle of it, and then at the end of it, you can summarize all that they've said. If you can do that, it's amazing what happens with the other person. They'll, maybe it's something fairly complex, and I've really been concentrating on what they're saying. In the middle of things, I've been saying, okay, this last point, let me make sure. I think this is what you're saying. Yep, that's what I'm saying. So then I get the end and I summarize it all, and they say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Well, now at this point, I could make a good judgment. We'll get to that in a minute, but they now know I truly have been listening to them. It's amazing how much trust you build when you actually do that kind of listening with people. The next practice is clarification. So this is where, first of all, asking questions, and you want to pose open-ended questions in order to gain more information. More than likely, almost 100% of the time, when somebody's telling you something, they are not telling you everything that's in their head. And so you need to practice asking them questions about what they're saying. You have sort of a thought in your head about it. And so, but you figure you're probably wrong and you want them to talk a little bit more broadly about it. So you say something like, I'm not really sure if I fully understand what you mean by that. Can you tell me more? Can you kind of give me some more examples of what you're talking about? That kind of thing. And the second is clarifying statements. So anytime there's something ambiguous, you want to clarify it. Or if you suspect that you might be using different definitions about something, or using a word. So I want to say, okay, when you know, let's say, when you say you're stressed, what specifically do you mean by stress? Because when I think of stress, that might be different than what you say stress. And then can you tell me what might be causing that? And so I ask a clarifying question, make sure I understand what they mean by stress. And then I asked an open-ended question where I'm wanting to to talk about how they get to that state. The next practice is empathy and validation. So you can practice making empathetic statements, expressing empathy and understanding. So you can say something like, that sounds really tough. And you may not even really understand, right? Maybe you don't really understand. And maybe you don't really understand, but obviously this has been really tough for them. So you just say something like, well, that sounds really tough. That builds that connection between the two of you, and it helps in the way in which the conversation can be productive as a foundation. So it's a good listening skill to have empathy, but it also creates the trust between the two of you for them maybe to give you more information that they're not giving you because they trust you more now. And so you can connect them better and you're going to understand them better. The second is validation. And this is where you say something that validates the person's feelings. And you don't have to agree with somebody to validate them. So maybe they're expressing their feelings on a matter, and maybe I don't agree with those feelings. But maybe I can say something like, I can see why you'd feel that way, right? And that it helps put them at ease so that you can engage in a more productive way, and you don't shut down the conversation. The next practice is non-judgmental attitudes. So the first is having an open mind. So you approach the conversation without forming judgments. You avoid interrupting or making assumptions. You want to be aware that you probably have assumptions. They may be correct, they may be incorrect, and you don't really know. And you might say, well, yeah, no, no, you don't. You don't know if you're correct or not. Assumptions are assumptions. You don't know yet if you're right. And so, you need to keep an open mind. Yeah, I might be wrong about what they're saying. I might have wrong ideas. They might be right. I just had a conversation, this earlier today with Jackson. I made a snap judgment about something, and before the conversation was done, I found out I was wrong. Right. So we don't want to do that, right? Keep that open mind so we can listen carefully. And then acceptance, where what we want to do is we need to accept that their perspective is valid in the sense of their own world. And so we may need to steer them away from whatever that is, but we're not ready for that yet. We're listening at this point, right? So we just need to take in their perspective and their feelings on the matter as valid, even if we currently disagree. We don't want to squash that, right away. So we need to take these things and we need to practice, practice, practice. We need to practice with our families. It's a good idea to assume that you need a lot of improvement in listening. Pretty much everybody does. Everybody can improve. Even if you're a good listener, you can still improve. But it's a pretty good idea to just assume that you're not a good listener and you need to improve a lot. And invite blunt, tough feedback from the people that you're closest to. So maybe this is your family, maybe it's not, but maybe it's your family, your spouse, especially. Invite tough feedback. I like this is doesn't quite relate, but I think it's a good example of what I mean by tough feedback. So I can at times get excited about a subject, and if maybe my wife and I are at dinner with another couple or something, and there's something that's come up, and I'm really excited about whatever that topic is, and I will run away with the conversation. I'll just start talking and talking and talking. Well, what I've done is I've given my wife permission to stop me in that process. And to the extent that, maybe she nudges me. If that doesn't work, or maybe she interrupts me about and tries to bring me in. And if I'm not paying attention, I've given her the right to say in front of other people, hey, you're going on too long about that. You need to let somebody else talk. And the reason I invited her to do that is because I want to change. I want to get better. I don't want to do this thing that I feel embarrassed about later, right? So in terms of listening, if I'm struggling with these things and I'm not even aware of it, I need my family, my people that again that I'm closest to, that to give me that tough love feedback. Practice with your friends. Friends are always good. A lot of times, this is true of your family too, but it's certainly true of your friends. They'll let you know if you tell them it's okay to, my if my breath is bad, I want my friends to tell me my breath is bad, right? If I'm a bad listener or I interrupt or I make snap judgments, tell your friends, hey, tell me when I'm doing that. Help me to not do that. You could do this with your coworkers. Might be a little bit more tricky with coworkers, but maybe you've got coworkers that will help you. Sometimes we're different at work than we are in our personal life, and we may have habits in our work life that we don't have in our personal life, and vice versa. And so, talking to your coworkers, about, hey, I'm trying to improve my active listening skills, and tell me, is there anything that I do, in especially in these categories that I probably need some improvement? You're bound to have at least one coworker that will work with you, tell you, talk to your boss. If tell your boss, hey, I really want to get better at this. Help me to know what am I doing that I need improvement, that kind of thing. And point it out to me when I'm doing it. And then practice with God and Jesus, right? Practice these active listening skills with God and Jesus. And in my prayer time, I certainly want to pray and tell God about things that I need to tell him about, or I need to ask about, and things that I need or whatever. But I also need to learn to listen. I need to practice listening with with the Father and with our Lord Jesus. And so just like I would do that, I want to invite, Lord, tell me when I'm listening, when I'm not listening well, and help me to grow and improve. In some of the categories that we talked about, it might seem to not imply like making eye contact, right? With God and Jesus, I can't make eye contact. But when you start to think about it, all eye contact really is about focus, right? So I'm learning to better focus on that other person. And so the bottom line is, if I will get good at all these things that we've talked about with people, it will help me to get good at listening to God and hearing him and discerning him, because I learned to just quiet my mind, to focus, to not interrupt, to not allow for distractions. I get distractions, out. I'm going to have a conversation with God. I don't want that. All those kind of practices are going to help me to be better. That they'll help me with people. They'll help me with God. And if I can tell that I'm getting better with people, then I will know I'm going to be getting better with God. Okay, so next, we're gonna I'm gonna open it up for questions and thoughts and that sort of stuff. But if you've enjoyed this teaching, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the bell for notifications. We love getting feedback and questions and comments, that kind of thing. So please, comment on the video. We'd love to have a discussion with you about it. If you've come to this video through Facebook, it's probably in a post, give us a comment there. Let us know what you're thinking, what your questions are. Was this helpful? And then, be sure to visit the website, a2k church.org, the number 2K, the letter K, church.org. Come and check out the website. Check us out. If you're an isolated biblical Unitarian, then come and visit us, and we'd love to hear from you. I'm going to keep the recording going and see what the folks here online have to say about all this.